Have you ever been so misunderstood that you just stopped trying to explain yourself? What if I told you that sometimes being underestimated is the greatest gift anyone could ever give you? Let me take you back to a moment that changed everything for me. A moment when I realized that silence could be more powerful than any explanation I could ever offer. It was a crisp autumn evening, and I was sitting alone in my apartment scrolling through my phone when I saw it. A family group chat message from my Aunt Karen that made my stomach drop. She had written something about organizing a fundraiser for me, talking about how hard things must be, how they were all so worried about their dear nephew who was going through such difficult times. My cousin Jennifer had replied with a crying emoji and wrote about how she wished she could help more. Uncle Robert chimed in with advice about government assistance programs. There they were, my entire extended family, painting a picture of me as someone barely surviving, someone drowning in circumstances beyond his control, someone who needed rescuing. The irony was almost beautiful in its absurdity. As I sat there in my luxury apartment, the one I had purchased outright 6 months earlier, overlooking the city lights that sparkled like diamonds scattered across black velvet, I couldn't help but laugh. It wasn't a bitter laugh, not really. It was the kind of laugh that comes from a place of disbelief mixed with a strange sense of liberation. You see, about 3 years ago, I had made a decision that would alter the trajectory of my entire life. I had chosen to step away from the family business, the one my father had built from the ground up, the one that everyone expected me to take over someday. That decision had been met with disappointment, confusion, and ultimately, judgment. My father had looked at me across his mahogany desk, his face a mixture of anger and something that looked dangerously close to disgust, and told me I was making the biggest mistake of my life. My mother had cried for weeks. My siblings had stopped calling. The extended family? Well, they had simply assumed I had failed at whatever I was trying to do on my own. They assumed I was too proud to come back. They assumed I was struggling, barely making ends meet, probably living in some run-down studio apartment, eating ramen noodles for dinner, and regretting every choice that had led me away from the security of the family empire. And you know what? I let them assume. I let them build their narrative brick by brick, until it became a solid wall between us. But here's the thing that nobody knew. The secret I carried like a precious jewel hidden in my pocket. That decision to leave, that choice that everyone thought would ruin me, had actually been the beginning of my greatest success. The tech startup I had quietly launched from my bedroom, the one I had poured my savings into, the one I had worked on during sleepless nights while the rest of the world dreamed, had taken off in ways I had never even imagined possible. Within 18 months, we had secured major funding. Within 2 years, we had gone international. By year 3, I had sold my shares for an amount that made my father's successful business look like a lemonade stand in comparison. But I didn't tell anyone. I didn't post about it on social media. I didn't show up at family gatherings in expensive cars or designer clothes. I maintained the same modest appearance I had always had, the same quiet demeanor, the same humble smile. When relatives asked how I was doing, I simply said I was managing, getting by, figuring things out, and they heard exactly what they wanted to hear. Confirmation that their predictions had been right, that leaving the family path had been a mistake, that I was paying the price for my rebellion. The beauty of it all was in the freedom their assumptions gave me. There's something incredibly liberating about being underestimated. When people think you have nothing, they stop expecting anything from you. They stop asking for favors. They stop involving you in their drama. They stop competing with you. They treat you with a kind of pitying kindness that, while sometimes annoying, creates a buffer zone around your life. I could focus entirely on building my empire without the pressure of family expectations, without the jealousy that success often brings, without the constant requests for money or investment opportunities or advice on their failing ventures. My younger cousin Marcus, who used to look up to me, had recently started his own business with money from our grandfather, and he would send me encouraging messages about not giving up, about how even though I wasn't as fortunate as him to have family support, I should keep trying. The messages were well-intentioned, I suppose, but they revealed so much about his perception of reality. He had no idea that the software his company was using, the very platform that was helping him manage his inventory, was something my company had developed. He was literally paying me every month through a service subscription, without having any clue that his struggling cousin was the one providing it. Have you ever experienced that moment when you realize that people's perceptions of you have almost nothing to do with who you actually are? It's both unsettling and enlightening. I would attend family dinners and they would unfold like theater performances where everyone knew their lines except me. Aunt Linda would pull me aside with cash tucked into a card, whispering that she knew things were tight and I shouldn't be too proud to accept help. I would thank her graciously, add the money to my charitable giving account, and later that week donate 10 times that amount to causes I believed in. The gap between their perception and my reality had become a chasm so wide it was almost comical. But in those moments, sitting at those dinner tables, passing the mashed potatoes and listening to their thinly veiled comments about responsibility and practical choices, I would feel something complex brewing inside me. It wasn't quite anger, wasn't quite amusement, wasn't quite sadness. It was more like a cocktail of all three, mixed with a shot of satisfaction and a splash of loneliness. The thing about success that nobody tells you is how isolating it can become, especially when you're carrying it alone in silence. There were moments, late at night, when I would sit in my home office surrounded by the evidence of everything I had built, and I would feel this overwhelming urge to just tell someone, to share this incredible journey with the people who had known me since I was a kid, riding bikes through the neighborhood. But every time I reached for my phone to call my sister or compose a message to my parents, something would stop me. Maybe it was pride, maybe it was fear, maybe it was the knowledge that once you reveal a secret, you can never take it back. The silence had become my companion, my strategy, my shield, and I wasn't sure I was ready to give it up. My business partner, David, was one of the few people who knew the full story of my family situation. He would often shake his head in disbelief when I would tell him about the latest family gathering. "How can you just sit there and let them think you're failing?" he would ask, genuinely confused by my choice. David came from a different kind of family, the kind that celebrated wins loudly and supported each other's ambitions openly. He couldn't understand the dynamics of a family that had built its identity around one particular path to success and viewed any deviation from that path as failure. I tried to explain it to him once, over drinks after we had closed a major deal. "When you grow up in a family business," I told him, "success isn't measured by what you achieve on your own. It's measured by whether you continue the legacy. Anything outside of that, no matter how successful, is seen as rejection. And rejection, even when it's not intended as such, is met with disappointment and eventually with the rewriting of your story. They need to believe I'm struggling, because it validates their original disappointment. If they knew I was thriving, they would have to confront the fact that their way wasn't the only way. And that's a much more uncomfortable truth than simply believing their rebellious nephew learned his lesson the hard way." David had nodded slowly, understanding dawning in his eyes. "So you're not just protecting yourself," he said. "You're protecting their worldview." I hadn't thought about it that way before, but he was right. My silence was an act of mercy in a strange sort of way, allowing them to maintain their beliefs while I quietly built a life that would have shattered those beliefs completely. The months turned into years, and the pattern continued. I became very good at playing the role they had assigned me. When my father mentioned at a holiday dinner that they were expanding the business and could always use another set of hands if I was ready to come back and be serious this time, I simply smiled and said I appreciated the offer, but was still figuring out my path. The satisfaction in his eyes at what he perceived as my continued floundering was almost palpable. He patted my shoulder with the kind of affection you might show a child who still believes in Santa Claus, a mixture of love and superiority, and told me the door was always open when I was ready to grow up. That night, I went home to my penthouse, the one that occupied the entire top floor of a building in the most exclusive part of the city, and I stood on my terrace looking out at a view that cost more per month than most people's annual salaries. The contrast between their perception and my reality had never felt more surreal. I poured myself a glass of wine from a bottle that cost more than what my aunt had slipped me in that card, and I wondered, not for the first time, what it would feel like to finally tell them the truth. But then I thought about what would happen next. The disbelief, followed by the demands for proof, the awkward recalibration of family dynamics, the sudden requests for investments in their various projects, the resentment that would inevitably creep in, because success, especially unexpected success, often breeds more resentment than sympathy ever could. The questions about why I had kept it secret for so long, the accusations of being dishonest or playing games with their emotions, the transformation of our relationship from genuine, if misguided, concern to something transactional and complicated. No, the silence was better. The silence was cleaner. The silence allowed me to maintain some semblance of authentic connection with them, even if that connection was built on a fundamental misunderstanding. My cousin Jennifer, the one who had posted crying emojis about my situation, had recently gone through a difficult divorce. She called me one evening and we talked for hours about heartbreak and starting over and finding yourself when everything you thought you knew has been turned upside down. It was one of the most genuine conversations I had had with any family member in years. She felt comfortable being vulnerable with me because she thought we were both struggling in our own ways. She saw me as a fellow traveler on the difficult road of life, not as someone who had it all figured out. If I told her the truth about my situation, would she still call me when she was feeling lost? Would she still trust me with her fears and insecurities? Or would I become, in her eyes, someone who couldn't possibly understand what she was going through, someone separated from her reality by the buffer of wealth and success? These were the calculations I made constantly, weighing the cost of truth against the value of authentic connection, however imperfect that connection might be. There's a psychological phenomenon I had read about once, something about how people need their narratives to make sense, and they will unconsciously filter information to maintain those narratives. My family had created a story about me, and every interaction we had was being filtered through that story. When I showed up to events in modest clothing, it confirmed their story. When I didn't ask them for help, it was because I was too proud, which also fit their story. When I seemed content despite my supposed struggles, it was because I was putting on a brave face which made them feel even more sympathetic. Everything I did or didn't do was being interpreted through the lens of their preconceived notions, and in a weird way it made my life easier. I didn't have to manage their expectations because they had already set those expectations so low that I couldn't possibly disappoint them. The business continued to grow. We launched in 17 new countries. We acquired 2 smaller competitors. We were being courted by major tech giants for a potential acquisition that would put my net worth into the territory where you start needing wealth managers and estate planners, and all sorts of professionals whose sole job is to help you figure out what to do with more money than you could spend in several lifetimes. And through it all, I maintained my double life with the precision of a method actor who never breaks character. I drove a 7-year-old sedan to family events. I wore clothes from mid-range stores. I lived in my penthouse like a king during the week and transformed into their perception of a struggling entrepreneur every time I stepped into their world. The cognitive dissonance should have been overwhelming, but instead it became strangely comfortable. I was 2 different people, and both versions were authentically me in their own way. The struggling nephew was who I had been once, in those early days when the business was just an idea, and I was genuinely uncertain about whether I had made a terrible mistake. The successful entrepreneur was who I had become, but that version didn't need the validation or recognition from my family to feel real. One particularly memorable evening, my Uncle Robert, who had always been the most vocal about my life choices, invited me to dinner at an expensive restaurant. I met him there assuming it was just another family meal, but it turned out he had an ulterior motive. After we ordered, he leaned across the table with that concerned expression that people wear when they're about to offer unwanted advice, and he told me he had been thinking about my situation a lot. He said he had talked to a friend who ran a consulting firm, and they were looking for someone to do basic data entry work. It didn't pay much, he admitted, but it was honest work, and it could be a stepping stone to something better if I applied myself. He had already talked to his friend about me, and there was an interview scheduled for the following week if I was interested. The recommendation was his gift to me, a hand up from someone who was doing well to someone who was struggling. I sat there staring at my uncle, this man who had known me my entire life, who had taught me how to fish when I was 8, who had always been kind despite his judgmental tendencies, and I felt a wave of emotion that was hard to name. Here he was, using his connections to try to help me get a data entry job, completely unaware that I employed over 300 people, that I had turned down acquisition offers in the hundreds of millions, that the watch he was wearing, which he had proudly told me was a bonus from his company, cost less than what I spent on a typical business dinner. The absurdity of the moment was so profound that I had to focus on my breathing to keep from laughing or crying or doing something that would break the spell. I thanked him sincerely. I told him I would think about it. I could see the relief in his eyes, the satisfaction of having done something concrete to help his wayward nephew. He paid for dinner, insisting despite my protests, and as we walked out to the parking lot, he put his arm around my shoulders and told me that things would get better. that this was just a rough patch, and that everyone goes through difficult times. The fact that I was willing to accept his help was a sign of maturity, he said, and he was proud of me for finally being realistic about my situation. I drove home in my modest sedan, but instead of going straight to my penthouse, I drove around the city for hours just thinking, what was I doing? Why was I maintaining this charade? Was it really protecting them, or was I protecting myself? From what? From their judgment? But I had already experienced their judgment when I left the family business. From their expectations? But letting them think I was failing was its own kind of burden. From their requests for help? Maybe that was part of it, but was it really worth all this deception? Have you ever created a situation that started for one reason but continued for completely different reasons that you didn't fully understand yourself? That's where I found myself, trapped in a web of my own making, unable to clearly articulate even to myself why I kept pulling the threads tighter. The following week, I didn't go to the interview my uncle had set up, but I did send him a text saying the position wasn't quite the right fit, thanking him profusely for thinking of me. He responded with encouragement, telling me not to be discouraged, that the right opportunity would come along if I kept looking. That same week, I signed a deal that would triple our company's valuation. The juxtaposition was becoming almost painful. My life had split into two parallel realities that occasionally intersected in these moments of surreal disconnect. In one reality, I was a successful tech entrepreneur being courted by venture capitalists and featured in industry publications under a pseudonym that protected my privacy. In the other reality, I was a struggling young man who couldn't quite get his act together, a source of concern and pity for relatives who had written me off as a cautionary tale about the dangers of youthful rebellion. The question that kept haunting me was which reality was more real. Success in business is one thing, but success in life is something else entirely. Did it matter that I had built an empire if I couldn't share that achievement with the people who had known me before I was anyone, before I had accomplished anything? Was there any real victory in proving them wrong, if they never knew they had been wrong in the first place? These philosophical questions would swirl around my mind during long flights to business meetings, during presentations to potential investors, during team meetings where we celebrated our latest milestones. I would be physically present but mentally somewhere else, straddling these two worlds and belonging fully to neither. My therapist? Yes, I had a therapist, because even successful people need help navigating the complexities of their inner lives, especially successful people if we're being honest, suggested that I was avoiding confrontation by maintaining the status quo. She pointed out that my family's misunderstanding was convenient in a way, that it allowed me to remain connected to them without having to navigate the messier emotions that truth might bring. She asked me what I was really afraid of, and I gave her all the rational answers about not wanting to deal with jealousy or requests for money, or the complications that revealing my success would bring. But she pushed deeper, and eventually, in one of those breakthrough moments that therapy sometimes provides, I admitted something I had barely admitted to myself. I was afraid that if they knew the truth, they would want a relationship with the successful version of me, but that version wasn't the real me either. The real me was somewhere in between. The kid who grew up in their world but dreamed of something different. The young man who took a terrifying leap into the unknown. The entrepreneur who succeeded beyond his wildest imagination, but still felt like that scared kid sometimes. I was afraid that revealing my success would mean losing whatever authentic connection still existed, however flawed, and replacing it with something hollow and transactional. At least when they thought I was struggling, their concern was genuine, even if it was based on a misunderstanding. What would I get instead? Admiration? Envy? Requests for help? None of those things felt like love. And despite everything, despite the years of judgment and misunderstanding, I still wanted their love, or at least the memory of what their love had felt like before I had disappointed them. This realization hit me like a physical force. I had been so focused on the practical reasons for maintaining my secret that I had completely missed the emotional truth underlying it all. I was still that kid who wanted his family's approval, even if I was getting it under false pretenses. The success I had achieved was supposed to prove that I had made the right choice, but what good was that proof if the people I wanted to prove it to never saw it? I was winning a game that nobody else knew I was playing, and the victory felt increasingly empty. Around this time, something happened that would begin to shift my perspective entirely. My grandmother, my father's mother, fell ill. It wasn't immediately life-threatening, but it was serious enough that the family rallied around her, taking turns staying at the hospital, making sure she was never alone. I took my shifts, like everyone else, sitting in those uncomfortable hospital chairs, watching machines beep and monitor her vital signs. During one of my late-night shifts, when it was just the two of us in that sterile room with its fluorescent lights and antiseptic smell, she opened her eyes and looked at me with a clarity that seemed to cut through all the medication and fatigue. She asked me how I was really doing, and there was something in her tone, some quality of genuine curiosity rather than polite inquiry, that made me pause. I gave my standard answer about managing and figuring things out, but she waved her hand dismissively, the IV line trailing from her wrist like a tether to the mechanical world keeping her alive. "That's what you tell everyone," she said, her voice weak but firm. "But I'm asking what you're not telling everyone." I stared at her. This woman who had been a constant presence throughout my childhood, who had made me cookies and taken me to parks and told me stories about the old country, and I felt something crack inside me. Maybe it was the vulnerability of seeing her in that hospital bed. Maybe it was the exhaustion from maintaining my double life. Maybe it was the stark reminder that time is finite, and secrets die with the people who keep them. Whatever the reason, I started talking. I told her everything. I told her about the business, about the success, about the money, about maintaining the charade, about why I had let everyone believe I was struggling. I talked for what felt like hours, though it was probably only 20 minutes or so, and she listened without interrupting, her eyes never leaving my face. When I finally finished, emptied of words and feeling raw in a way I hadn't felt in years, she was quiet for a long moment. Then she smiled, and it wasn't the pitying smile I had grown accustomed to from family members, nor was it the impressed smile I got from business associates who only knew the successful version of me. It was something else entirely, something that looked like understanding mixed with a touch of sadness. "You're just like your grandfather," she said finally, and that confused me because my grandfather, her husband, had been the one who started the family business that I had walked away from. She must have seen my confusion because she laughed, which turned into a cough, and I handed her water, and after she drank, she continued. "Your grandfather didn't want to run a business," she said. "He wanted to be a musician, did you know that?" I didn't know that. Nobody had ever mentioned it. Apparently he had been quite talented, played the saxophone, had dreams of making it professionally. But then life happened, as it does. They got married. My father was born. Money was tight, and his parents had a small business they needed help with. So he set aside his saxophone, and he built that business into something substantial, something that provided security for his family. But late at night, even years later, she would sometimes wake up and find him in the garage playing that old saxophone, chasing the ghost of the dream he had given up. He never regretted his choice, she said, not really, because he loved his family and took pride in providing for them. But there was always this part of him that wondered what might have been. And when your father showed interest in the business, when it became clear that the legacy would continue, your grandfather was both proud and a little sad. Proud because his work would outlive him, sad because he knew that his son and eventually his grandson might end up trapped by the same expectations that had shaped his own life. I sat there processing this information, trying to reconcile this image of my grandfather as a frustrated artist with the stern businessmen I had known. "Your grandfather told me once," my grandmother continued, "that if any of his grandchildren ever showed the courage to chase their own dreams instead of following the path laid out for them, I should tell them something." She paused, and I leaned forward, desperate to hear these words from beyond the grave, this message I hadn't known existed. He said to tell them that real success isn't measured by money or prestige, or even family approval. Real success is measured by whether you're living your truth or living someone else's version of your truth. He said that he hoped at least one of his grandchildren would be brave enough to choose their own path, and he hoped that when they did, the family would be wise enough to support them instead of judge them. But he also said he understood why someone might choose to pursue their dreams quietly, without fanfare or family understanding, because sometimes the only way to build something genuine is to build it away from the expectations and opinions of people who love you but don't understand you. My grandmother squeezed my hand with surprising strength. "He would be proud of you," she said, "not because you're successful, though he would love that too, but because you had the courage to walk away and build something of your own. But honey," she continued, her voice getting softer, "he would also tell you that life is too short to live it in hiding. The people who love you deserve to know who you really are, and you deserve to be known for who you really are, not for who they think you are." That conversation changed something fundamental in me. It was like a key turning in a lock I hadn't even realized was there. I stayed with my grandmother through the night, and we talked about other things, lighter things, memories from my childhood, gossip about relatives, her hopes for her recovery. But that core message hung in the air between us like a blessing, like permission I hadn't known I was waiting for. When my shift ended and my cousin came to relieve me, I walked out of that hospital into the early morning light feeling different, feeling like something had shifted in my understanding of everything I had been doing and why. Over the following weeks, as my grandmother recovered and eventually went home, I found myself reevaluating my entire approach. The secret that had felt like protection now felt increasingly like a prison. The freedom I thought I had gained by being underestimated now felt like a different kind of constraint. I started small, testing the waters. When my sister called to check in, as she occasionally did, instead of giving my usual vague answers, I mentioned that my business was doing well, that I had recently closed a significant deal. There was a pause on the line, and then she asked what kind of business, and I told her a simplified version of what my company did. She sounded genuinely interested, asking questions that showed she was actually listening and trying to understand, rather than just waiting for her turn to give advice. It was such a different dynamic than I had expected, such a different response than the judgment or disbelief I had imagined. We talked for over an hour, and it was the best conversation I had had with my sister in years. She told me she had always wondered what I was really up to, that she had suspected I wasn't actually struggling as much as everyone thought, because I never seemed stressed or desperate. She admitted that the family's constant concern had always felt a bit performative to her, like everyone was more invested in their narrative of my failure than in actually understanding what was happening in my life. "Why didn't you ever ask me directly?" I questioned. And she was quiet for a moment before admitting that she had been afraid. "Afraid of what?" I pressed. And she said she had been afraid that if she questioned the family narrative, she would be seen as disloyal, and afraid that if it turned out I really was struggling and she had been wrong to defend me, she would feel guilty for not helping more. So it was easier to just go along with what everyone else believed while privately hoping I was doing better than they thought. This insight into her perspective, into the complexity of her position within the family dynamics, made me realize how many assumptions I had been making about everyone's motivations and understanding. I had been so focused on maintaining my secret that I hadn't considered that maybe, just maybe, some people were maintaining their own versions of silence, their own forms of protection. My sister became my confidant in a way she had never been before. She didn't tell the rest of the family, respecting my privacy and my timing, but she knew. And having someone who knew felt like releasing pressure I hadn't realized I had been carrying. She would text me congratulations when we hit new milestones, having set up a Google alert for my company after I told her the name. She would send me memes about imposter syndrome and the challenges of entrepreneurship. She would call just to check in on how I was really doing, not how she assumed I was doing. It was the beginning of rebuilding our relationship on a foundation of truth rather than misunderstanding, and it felt like coming home after a long journey. Emboldened by this success, I decided to tell my younger brother next. His response was completely different. He was angry, furiously angry in a way I hadn't anticipated. He felt lied to, manipulated, made to look foolish. He recounted all the times he had tried to give me advice, all the times he had felt sorry for me, all the concern he had wasted on someone who apparently didn't need it. "How could you let us all worry about you when you were fine?" he demanded. "How could you sit there at family dinners and accept our pity like some kind of sick joke?" I tried to explain my reasoning, the fears that had kept me silent, the complexity of family expectations, but he didn't want to hear it. To him, my secret was a betrayal of trust, an indication that I thought I was better than everyone else, too good to share my life with the family that had raised me. We didn't speak for weeks after that conversation, and it confirmed some of my worst fears about what revelation would bring. But it also clarified something important. The truth was going to hurt some people no matter how or when I shared it, and continuing to hide it was just postponing that hurt, not preventing it. My brother and I eventually reconciled, sort of. He came around to a grudging understanding of my perspective, though he never fully forgave what he saw as years of deception. Our relationship remained strained, more formal than it had been even during the years when he thought I was struggling. It was a price I had to pay for years of secrecy, and while I regretted his pain, I didn't regret my choice to finally be honest. These conversations with my siblings, one positive and one painful, made me realize that there was no perfect way to handle the situation, no magical approach that would make everyone understand and accept my choices without hurt feelings or complications. The question wasn't whether revealing the truth would cause problems, it definitely would. The question was whether living authentically was worth dealing with those problems. My grandmother's words kept echoing in my mind about life being too short to live it in hiding, about deserving to be known for who I really am. The next family gathering was Thanksgiving, several months after my grandmother's hospitalization. She had made a full recovery and was back to her usual self, hosting the dinner at her house like she had done for decades. I arrived early to help with preparations, and she pulled me aside in the kitchen, away from the relatives who were starting to arrive. "Have you thought about what we discussed?" she asked, and I nodded, telling her about my conversations with my siblings, about the mixed results, about my continued uncertainty about revealing everything to everyone. She listened, stirring a pot of gravy with the kind of focused attention that suggested she was thinking about more than just the consistency of the sauce. Then she said something that surprised me. "You don't have to make a grand announcement, you know. You don't owe everyone a detailed explanation of the last few years, but you do owe yourself the freedom to stop pretending. Maybe instead of thinking about it as revealing a secret, think about it as simply stopping the act of hiding. Let people discover the truth naturally. Answer questions honestly when they're asked. Stop deflecting and dodging. See what happens when you just exist as yourself without trying to manage everyone's perceptions." This approach appealed to me in a way that planning some big revelation never had. So that's what I started doing. At that Thanksgiving dinner, when Uncle Robert asked how things were going, I didn't give my usual vague response. I said things were going really well, actually, that my business had expanded significantly over the past year. He looked surprised, asked what kind of business, and I told him. Others around the table started paying attention, asking questions, and I answered them honestly, though without bragging or going into excessive detail about the financial success. It was strange watching their faces as they processed this information, seeing the visible recalibration happening in real time. Some looked skeptical, clearly wondering if I was exaggerating or delusional about the state of my business. Others looked confused, trying to reconcile this new information with the narrative they had built. My father, sitting at the head of the table, said nothing, just watched me with an expression I couldn't quite read. As the evening progressed, the questions continued. My cousin Marcus, the one who had been sending me encouraging messages about not giving up, asked pointed questions about revenue and scaling that revealed he didn't quite believe I was being truthful about the scope of my success. So I pulled out my phone and showed him our company website, showed him articles in tech publications, showed him proof that this wasn't a fantasy or exaggeration. His face went through several complicated emotions that I recognized from my own mirror. Pride at a family member's success, embarrassment at having underestimated me, confusion about why I had let him believe otherwise, maybe a touch of envy. The dinner ended on an awkward note, not hostile exactly, but definitely uncomfortable, with everyone leaving with more questions than answers. Over the following weeks, the family grapevine did its work. People called, sent messages, some congratulating me, some demanding to know why I had hidden my success, some hurt that I hadn't trusted them with the truth, some excited about potential investment opportunities or ways I could help with their own ventures, just as I had feared. My relationship with my parents remained complicated. My mother called crying, not from joy at my success, but from hurt that I had kept it from her for so long. She felt excluded from a major part of my life, felt like I had been punishing her for not supporting my initial decision to leave the family business. It was a difficult conversation, one of many we would have over the coming months as we worked through layers of misunderstanding and hurt. My father's response was more measured. He invited me to lunch, just the two of us, at a quiet restaurant far from the usual family haunts. We sat across from each other, and I could see him struggling with what to say, how to bridge the gap that had grown between us over years of disappointment and misunderstanding. Finally, he said that he had been wrong to react the way he did when I left the business, wrong to write off my ambitions as foolish, wrong to take my different path as a personal rejection. He admitted that part of him had needed me to fail to justify his own choices, his own path, and seeing me succeed independently challenged something fundamental about how he viewed the world. But he also said he was proud of me, genuinely proud, and wished I had let him be part of the journey even if he couldn't support it the way I wanted at the beginning. It wasn't a perfect reconciliation. We still had fundamental differences in how we viewed success and family obligations and the legacy we're supposed to leave. But it was honest in a way our relationship hadn't been in years. Have you ever noticed how the truth, even when it's complicated and messy, feels cleaner than the most carefully maintained lie? That's what I was discovering in those months after I stopped actively hiding my success. Yes, there were hurt feelings. Yes, some relationships became more complicated rather than less. Yes, some family members suddenly wanted things from me that they hadn't wanted when they thought I was struggling. But there was also this incredible lightness that came from not having to maintain two separate versions of myself, from not having to carefully monitor every word I said at family gatherings, from not having to hide achievements that I had worked incredibly hard to earn. My relationship with my cousin Jennifer deepened in unexpected ways. She initially felt betrayed that I had let her pour out her heart about her divorce and struggles when she thought we were both in difficult places, but eventually she came to understand that my success in business didn't mean I didn't understand struggle. We all struggle with different things, and being successful professionally doesn't exempt you from emotional challenges or personal difficulties. In fact, having money and success sometimes complicates things rather than simplifying them. Our conversations continued, but they were richer now, more balanced, with both of us sharing victories and challenges rather than her assuming I only had challenges to share. The family dynamics shifted in ways both predictable and surprising. Some relatives did start asking for money or investment opportunities, and I had to set boundaries, something I had never been good at before. Learning to say no to family members who now knew I could afford to say yes was its own kind of challenge, its own kind of growth. But there were also unexpected benefits. My uncle, the same one who had tried to help me get a data entry job, became genuinely interested in my business and offered advice from his own years of experience that was actually helpful. We developed a mentorship relationship in reverse, with me learning from his wisdom about navigating complex business relationships, while he learned from me about emerging technologies and new market approaches. As I sit here now, reflecting on this entire journey from secret success to open authenticity, I realize that there's no simple moral to this story. Was I wrong to hide my success for so long? Maybe. Did it protect me from complications and expectations that might have derailed my focus? Probably. Did it also rob me of the ability to share my achievements with the people who had known me longest? Definitely. Would I do it differently if I could go back? I honestly don't know. What I do know is that living authentically, even when it's messy and complicated, beats living in hiding, no matter how comfortable that hiding place might feel. The freedom to be fully yourself, to own your achievements without apology, to let people know you for who you really are, rather than who they assume you are. That freedom is worth the awkwardness and the difficult conversations and the shifting relationships. My grandmother was right about so many things, but especially about this. Life is too short to spend it managing other people's perceptions of you. And here's what I want you to take away from my story. If you're in a situation where people have underestimated you, where they've written you off or assumed the worst, I understand the temptation to let them keep assuming. I understand the appeal of proving them wrong in silence, of succeeding without their knowledge or validation. But I also want you to understand the cost of that choice. Every moment you spend hiding your light, you're denying yourself the full experience of your own success. You're trading authentic connection for the safety of low expectations. And while that trade might feel worth it sometimes, eventually you'll realize that the people who truly matter deserve to know the real you, accomplishments and all. And you deserve to be known. If you've been hiding your success, your growth, your achievements because you're afraid of how people will react, I want you to know that their reaction is about them, not about you. Your success is yours to own, yours to celebrate, yours to share if and when you choose. Don't let fear or family dynamics or past judgments keep you from living fully in your truth. The right people will celebrate with you. The wrong people will reveal themselves. And you'll discover that being authentically yourself, complete with all your successes and failures, is infinitely better than being a carefully curated version designed to match someone else's expectations. So here's what I'm asking you to do. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever been underestimated or written off or had people assume you were struggling when you were actually thriving, I want to hear about it. Drop a comment below and tell me your story. Have you ever let people keep their assumptions about you? Did you eventually reveal the truth, or are you still living in that space between perception and reality? What did you learn from the experience? Your story matters, and sharing it might help someone else who's navigating the same complicated territory. And if you've made it this far in the story, if you've invested this time in understanding my journey, I want to ask for something. Understanding the full complexity of situations like this, recognizing that success and family and truth and perception are all complicated in ways that don't fit into easy narratives, that understanding matters. It helps us be more compassionate with ourselves and others. It helps us recognize that people's lives are usually much more complex than they appear from the outside. So take a moment to really sit with that understanding. Let it inform how you see your own life and the lives of people around you. If this story touched your heart, if it made you think differently about success or family or authenticity, hit that like button. Your engagement helps other people find these stories, helps create a community of people who understand that life is complicated and messy and beautiful in its complexity. And here's the most important thing: subscribe to Living Through It. This channel is dedicated to sharing real stories about navigating the complex realities of life, about living through the difficult moments and coming out the other side with wisdom and perspective. These aren't fairy tales with simple morals. These are real experiences with all their contradictions and complications intact. By subscribing, you're joining a community of people who understand that growth is messy, that truth is complicated, and that the most important stories are the ones that reflect life as it really is, not as we wish it would be. Hit that notification bell too, because I share new stories regularly, and trust me, you won't want to miss what's coming next. Remember, your success doesn't need anyone's validation to be real, but sharing it authentically can transform your relationships and your experience of that success. Stop hiding your light. The world needs to see what you're capable of, and you need to experience the full joy of your achievements. Thank you for listening to my story. Thank you for being part of this community. And remember, whatever you're living through right now, you're not alone, and your story matters.